Hello! In this video, I'll be trying out different brushes that I downloaded recently in Procreate before the update was done, and I'm drawing a sexy tiefling in a bikini here. You can go get your own free brushes. This first brush is the sketch brush from the Pablo Peruzzi brush set. It's a very good brush set I recently got that I've been enjoying using a lot. I'm also going to try out various other brushes that aren't from this set during this video, so I can test them out and see what I like. I'm also working on an ultimate set of brushes, so I can actually find my favorite brushes I use in Procreate. Here I'm trying out a different brush. This is an opaque smooth gouache brush. I'm actually not certain exactly where I got it from. This one's actually very fun, and I find it's pretty decent as well to switch it to a lower opacity, but it's also good on full opacity for large areas. The basic HRB Soft Pablo Peruzzi brush is what I'm using now to add more details to the skin. It's a very nice and pleasant to use soft brush that I think is actually really very useful, and I understand why it made it onto his main set. Next, I try out the Color Dodge brush. Without having to make a separate layer, I can add on the highlights, which I might do on hard light, soft light, or color dodge layer otherwise. Very soon I'm going to turn off the layers that show the artwork of the figure, so that instead I can simply test out these different downloaded texture type brushes. After testing many of them out, I decided a lot of them were too pale for most of my needs, although sometimes you want a subtle effect, sometimes you want one to be more pronounced. So I decided it would be worth my effort to duplicate all the ones that were too subtle and increase the maximum opacity under the brush setting. Later I'll show you specifically how to do this. You can raise or lower the opacity. When you duplicate a brush, you don't have to worry about messing around with the original one, and you'll just be able to experiment with a copy. When you do this, you don't have to worry about losing the original brush that might be quite good for certain techniques. And here I start working on the background. I do use different layers, as well as testing out the Pablo Peruzzi Multiply brush, which allows you to do multiply-like effects on the same layer that you're on, rather than creating a separate one. You may still want to create a separate layer depending on the type of artwork you're working on and how much you want to go back or modify your piece. I advise you attempt to use layers to your advantage. You can only have so many layers in Procreate, so you need to take this into consideration, but sometimes it is a much better idea, especially with major experiments or things you might want to change later, to still use separate layers. Mostly I'm using the basic HRB brush, the Color Dodge brush, the Opaque Smooth Gouache brush here. I'm also using a couple other brushes in with it, but mostly those three. I end up deciding that I want to use a little bit more obvious line art on this one, so I later end up duplicating and setting to multiply the line art and putting them above a lot of the other layers. I end up also making an alternate version of the bikini, and I have saved both versions of this art because I like the original bikini as well as my different version I'm going to do soon. Overall, there are basically two main ways you can test out brushes. One is more on a blank canvas to test out how the brush physically works by swatching it. Another is to actually try painting with it, to actually try creating artwork, to see how the brush works. I advise once you do both these techniques, you also think about other ways you can use the brush. Here I'm trying the nail brush, which to me looks like a gradient. So I decided to try to use it to get the core shadows and the terminator of the shading. I think it works well for this, and I'm certain there's probably another way I can use it. Previously created from photographs of brick walls that were public domain, I used my brick stamp brush, and I used some of my new stamp brushes that I recently downloaded to help make this background tapestry. I do use different lighting layers and multiply layers to help get things, as well as previously downloaded texture brushes to add to the texture in the tapestry. I didn't only 100% try out new brushes. I made a slightly more censored bikini version, and here I'm going to do an alternate bikini of a slightly brighter blue color. I like both versions like I said, so I actually have saved copies of more than one version here. I continue working and trying out different things. When you want to make a new clothing option, I advise you make a new layer. This is very good for trying out clothing, costume designs, and different options for your own original characters. As well as if you decide to change your mind on the design, it's easy enough to clear or delete a layer versus having to paint over the entire thing. Look at examples. Highlights are usually not too bold on fabric. If you'd like to modify a brush, duplicate it by swiping to the left and hitting duplicate, then tap on the brush. Go to properties. If you lower the maximum opacity, for example, you'll make a lighter version of the brush that'll start less opaque. When you go to About Brush, go to the name, tap it, then you can change the name to reflect the alterations, such as Lighter Sketch. Then hit Done. You can also modify the brushes in other ways than what I showed you here by messing around with the settings. Always duplicate so you don't run into problems with the original you copy. I'm continuing to try out these brushes and other new brushes. This is mostly done with the sketch brush. I'm working out the bodies and positions for a couple characters. This is a fan art for Critical Role of Jester and Veth, two characters from Campaign 2. Jester is created and played by Laura Bailey, and Veth is created and played by Sam Riegel. Jester is a tiefling, and Veth is a halfling, so the height difference is a big deal. I used some 3D models on a reference sheet off screen in order to try to work this out. I also marked approximately where the head height should be. I messed up that original body, so I erased it entirely and decided to completely redraw it after working on Jester's features a bit more. I go back and forth and figure out a bit of the winter design. Halflings are just that, about half the height. I don't know Veth's exact height and Jester's exact height from the research I was doing, so I just had to approximately guess what I think it should be approximately. The outfit descriptions were given in fairly great detail in a recent episode of Critical Role, so I was able to look up reference and help me figure it out. However, I still wasn't entirely certain about a couple of the things that they said, and the other thing is, you should feel free to make corrections as much as needed. I had to correct that backhand an awful lot. I lowered the opacity in some of the sketch layers so that the visual appearance of the base that I'm drawing over on a layer above doesn't get in the way of what I'm working on. Later I can remove the opacity on certain things if I want. I'm fixing this up a bit to add in Jester's tail, and so I can save the sketch layer as its own thing if I wanted to do other clothing on these models later. Remember that you can also turn off the background entirely and keep line art on its own layer. To save a PNG in Procreate, that should be a clear background PNG so you have just a pure line art or other drawing saved. I'm also working on its own layer here, over the sketch layer, as a shadow layer on Multiply, just to work out some of the shadows. You can work in different orders. On a layer on top, I start doing the line art. I'm using the Foley brush, or line art brush, from Pablo Peruzzi's set. I used it briefly in the previous art, but I really put it through its paces here and discover it's quite a nice line art brush, so I understand why it made it on his top brush list. Here I continue working. I copied the actual official art's colors. I created color palettes in Procreate by, in a separate document, color picking the actual colors from the skin tones of the official art of the characters. I could have chosen to do my version of their skin tone, but often I like going with the canonical version or the official ones. Some of the in-between tones I came up with myself, but mostly I went with the official tones. Highlight, reflected light, and other colors can also be something I figure out based on the lighting in the scenario. I put the base color down for the skin tones on both of them, and then alpha locked the layer, so I didn't have to worry about going outside of the area. I turned alpha lock off to add more of the base tone for things like the hair and horns before alpha locking again and going back in with details. I often create a layer on top called tops to do things like the white highlights in the eyes and the very brightest highlights and a few other correction details that I might want to go on top of line art. Another thing I commonly do in these artworks is jump around a bit and turn alpha lock off and on, like I said, as needed. I also did the clothing on its own layer above the skin tone before merging them down later. Sometimes I do shadows on the base layer, especially if they're subtle, and other times I will use a multiply layer. As it's a pastel pink Lolita winter jacket with a Lolita dress under and very specific with antlered earmuffs, I was able to get good reference for that. For Jester's jacket, a white work that flares out but cinches at the waist with bell sleeves and light gray trim. I wasn't certain exactly what she meant by the boots, but that they have a knitted outerwear that goes over the top of them, I figured. And she said mittens, which I forgot till I was almost all the way through this as I changed them to gloves. Because gloves are so much more functional, I almost never depict or wear mittens in real life, so that is actually technically a mistake because she did say mittens. Anyway, I don't really regret changing it to gloves, even though officially she did say mittens, but I feel like I have to mention that because it's technically quote-unquote incorrect. I ended up spending a lot of time very soon. I used the sketching brush to add in the intricate stitching details. She said she wanted yellow bees, blue and pink flowers, and emerald green vines on certain areas of the outfit. I also used some of my newer brushes and some older brushes that I'm just deciding if they should make it on my favorite list as well, to add more of an aurora borealis in that gradient background I started with. I also added more of the turquoise aurora behind Veth so that the pink and turquoise would contrast, and kept more magenta and pink behind Jester so that the magenta and pink would contrast with the blue and the white more. I think this works better for the contrast of the composition. I used 3D models posed in these positions and sized like this using my PoseArt app Pro. I took photos of the 3D models, then opened them by split screening in my VizWrap app, which is also very useful, to look at the 3D models while I'm painting this. I'm also able to look at a bunch of other reference I gathered to help. Pictures of similar clothing, perhaps winter scenes, but also things like bees and flowers and vines, which very much helped me create this picture. In order to get the shadows, the general posing, and the size proportions more accurate, and they were very helpful. When it came to this, I went in my VizRef and I gathered a whole bunch of reference of bees, vines, and flower art, including morning glories and other vine flowers, to come up with these abstract and simplified versions. I ended up adding a purplish pink in the center of the blue blossoms for more contrast. Jester paid quite a lot of money for this custom outfit, so I figured it would be quite detailed. It did take me longer to do. I added the gray additional lines for further contrast in the design. Once again, that's all for this video. If you like my videos, please remember to like, subscribe, and turn on that notification bell to all notifications so you will know when a new video comes up. I aim for new videos every Wednesday, but sometimes life happens and things are delayed. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you with another one very soon.